Okay, so we will start with quantitative research, and this is a quick and brief introduction to validity and reliability. We're going to go into detail later on. But validity in quantitative research can also be translated to showing that there is not systematic errors in the methodology. So we want to show that our whole design doesn't have like a core mistake. So let me maybe give you an example. And maybe take note of this line. I think it's very powerful. The study design convinces the reader that it measures the concept that it claims to measure. So if I want to measure happiness, I want to convince the reader that I actually measure happiness in this quantitative approach. Or like I have in this example, if I want to show the reader that I am measuring the performance of a firm, I need to convince the reader that I am really measuring the performance. So that's why I wrote in here, maybe use profit, Tobin Q, ROA, ROI. These are some numbers that show financial performance in a firm. But would you use costs, for example? Would you use research and development cost to show performance? That's a bit confusing. That might be a mistake. To evaluate the performance and using costs, research and development costs, it doesn't make much sense. So validity is about that, convincing the reader that you want to measure performance. That's why you're using, you are measuring performance through this variable. And then reliability also as an introduction. The idea of reliability is to show that this study design doesn't have random errors. That and again, if you can take one sentence note, is this, I think is very powerful. In terms of reliability, the study design can be replicated without a problem, and the results from this replication will be the same. So reliability means that if you do the same steps, you will get the same number I got. Something similar to what we did in the quantitative lab. So one way of showing reliability is to, for example, to calculate the Cronbach alpha of the variables. You did that in the quantitative lab. You showed that your variable behaved in a way that it doesn't have this kind of random behavior. Like you use 3 or 4 questions to construct a variable that behaves in a way that is reliable. So if you are confused at this point, maybe it's fine because there are new concepts, but let's go into more detail and maybe you will be able to visualize this and you will also learn how to make it work. So going into more detail, we can actually divide validity in internal validity and external validity. Internal validity, again in simple words, aims to show that the study design is coherent. So here are a few techniques or a few suggestions that you can use to show that your research, your quantitative research, has internal validity. So in terms of your definitions, in terms of your variables, I mentioned that a lot in the lecture 6 and 7 of quantitative research, always borrow definitions and always borrow variables from previous studies. In that way, you are showing kind of consistency. You are not making up things out of nowhere. You are, if you want to measure performance, because performance is important, it's an important concept, use variables that have been used before. Profit, Tobin Q, ROA, ROI. There are many studies using these variables as performance. If you're going to do a survey, use questions that were used previously, so you don't have to worry about this, because then the reader will not argue, is this really performance? Well, yes, because previous research have also used it. So that's my suggestion. The same with measuring the variables. If you are going to use because that's a typical question, are we going to use Likert scale 1 to 10, 1 to 7, 1 to 5? Also, borrow inspiration and base your decision on previous studies. If previous studies have always used 1 to 10, use 1 to 10. So my suggestion is to borrow from here. The same also with ROA and profit and all of this. Are we going to use number in millions or in thousands or as it is? Borrow, get inspired by previous research and justify that. And then another very important thing is, because we talk about the study design, not only the variables, of course, the variables are important and these are suggestions, but to show internal validity of everything, that your study design is coherent, be very clear when in the literature review where you state your hypothesis. Why is this hypothesis theoretically based? Like, don't make a hypothesis out of air, like base your arguments on previous discussions, on previous knowledge. Also, a suggestion, draw a model. If it's quantitative, draw a model. What are the relationships that you expect? Which concept with which concept? And again, based on previous research. Otherwise, the reader will be very suspicious about the internal validity of your design. It will be like, you are telling me you want to measure performance, and it's not clear why this variable actually is performance. So you need to convince the reader about that from as I said in here. Basically, the common thing is to base your study on previous studies. And then external validity is a bit different. Internal validity is to show that the study is coherent. External validity is to show that the findings can be generalized to the population you are studying. Remember, if you again go back to the lectures on quantitative research, it is usually impossible to measure the whole population. So we usually tend to have a sample which is part of the population. So to show external validity, you need to discuss a little bit this. How is your sample and population connected? Like, is the sample really representing the population? Is it too much? Is it too less? The sample versus the population? Discuss this. Another useful thing that you need to discuss and you need to take in consideration is the use of control variables. When you have your method, maybe you have again like accounting control, intensity of accounting control, and performance. And you have two concepts. But if you do your statistical analysis only with these two, your model might be a bit weak in terms of explanatory power, this explanation power of the model. And remember, how do you measure that? You need to watch the lectures on quantitative research with the R-square. So maybe your model will have a very small R-square because it's not including many things. So a way to fix that and to improve the external validity is to include more control variables. So maybe you can include, for example, the size of the company, and to include that you can include number of employees. And it's a control variable. It doesn't matter if it's significant or not. The point is that it will be added in your model. And another thing that you can show to improve external validity is to discuss multicollinearity. And we did that also in the quant lab, just to make sure and to show the reader that you are not measuring the same thing twice. I mentioned like there could be a collinearity problem if you ask the age and the year of birth, because it's the same thing, just different number, but it's 20 years old and 2003, no? So it's the same thing, just in different numbers, and it will behave similar, so it will have a statistical problem. So also discuss that your model doesn't have multicollinearity. So far we have discussed validity in two kind of dimensions, internal and external. Now let's discuss reliability. And reliability, as we learned in the previous in this slide, it says reliability aims to convince the reader that if we replicate what we have done, we will get the same results. So keep that in mind. Reliability, if your study is reliable, you will duplicate it and it will be the same thing, the same results. And to show reliability, to show this consistency, as we discussed in the previous example, a very clear, a very specific way of measuring reliability is to do a Cronbach-Alpha test to measure your constructs, and this works well with survey data. So again, if you are going to measure happiness from using 4 questions based on previous research, also do the Cronbach-Alpha to show that this construct that you built with these 4 questions is also reliable. It is valid because it has been used before. So you are actually sure that you are measuring happiness because it has been used before. So you have internal validity, but also is reliable. You are showing that statistically, it doesn't behave randomly. It makes sense in your data, in your sample. Another approach that you can do if you don't have a survey, but you need to discuss this if it's necessarily, because sometimes it is not, is to do a normality test. Do you remember the normal distribution that things tend to be more towards the average? Like works, for example, with height. Like most of people are on the average and there is less people very tall and less people very short. So it's that distribution. So a lot of the statistical analysis that we use assume this normality. So maybe, but you need to discuss this in specific depending on your method of analysis, if you need to show normality. But that's another approach you can take. I teach, I think in the lectures, you learn how to do the Cronbach-Alpha test, but you didn't learn a lot about normality. And that's because it's not like you will have to discuss this all the time. I think this is super important, Cronbach-Alpha, for surveys. And normality, again, most of the things are normal. So sometimes maybe I'm a bit obvious in here, but the point is that that's another thing you can do to show that your variables are reliable, that they behave in normal way. And then in terms of analysis, because all of this is in the dimensions of the variables, but in terms of the analysis, something that you can do, and I think if you do this in your thesis, it will make it very powerful because it's not that common, is to do what we call robustness test. A robustness test is testing the same relationship, like again, intensity on accounting use and accounting systems and performance. But to do a robust test, you will measure performance in different ways, not only one way. So not only profit. Maybe you do one regression using profit, and then another regression using Tobin cube, and then another regression using ROI. So maybe you can make it work like that. Maybe you can show reliability of the analysis if you do this robustness test with different ways of measuring the same concept. So that's one way of doing it. And another way of doing it, and you did this in the quantitative lab, is to include more than one model to support or reject your hypothesis. So do not base your conclusion in only one model. Maybe have more than one. Maybe one where you have more controls. Maybe one where you have different years. Maybe one where you have I don't know. You can develop more models. I think that's what you did in the quant lab. You had one with more controls, one with even more controls, one with just the weak line without control. So also include more tests. So that's how you can show reliability. Use Cronbach-Alpha, show normality, use more than one variable to test your relationships, and also use more than one model to test for your hypothesis. And finally, this is not discussed in here in validity and reliability, but there is another important thing that you can add, which is objectivity in quantitative research. And here we can have like two approaches. On one sense, you can say, yeah, it's very clear. We discussed this on research philosophy, that quantitative research is objective. And that's true. But here, objectivity means more like you don't have your own agenda, that you don't want to test that you are obsessed with testing that accounting is good. And that's why sometimes you can see that in the narrative, in how the researcher builds their conclusions. You can see it as a reader. So be careful, filter for biases in your analysis, be careful in your conclusions, also triangulate with peers to make sure that you are not pushing an agenda, that you are not pushing your biases in there. It is even more obvious that it's quantitative, so it has to be objective, so even more important. And at the same time, it's also impossible, because we're humans, it's also impossible to not have some degree of biases. So the call or the suggestion is try it will be extremely difficult to be completely unbiased, completely objective. That's almost impossible. We're humans. Even in quantitative research, the way you write, the way you approach, the way you structure can be biased. So just be careful. I think like that's how you can show the objectivity. When you write, you can say like, you can write in your method section to ensure the objectivity. We distributed our conclusions with our peers, with our teachers, to make sure that the narrative was kind of neutral and we didn't get like bad feedback from that. So that's one way of doing it, because also being realistic, we are human, so we are a bit biased, but just be careful, attend that bias, and of course try to not have your own agenda. So that will be all for objective research, objective quantitative research. We will now move to qualitative in the next lecture.